Welcome to chapter 3 of Tsotsi. We've had two very brutal endings to chapters. At the end of chapter 1, of course, we had the murder of Gambu Dlamini. At the end of chapter 2, we had Tsotsi laying into Boston, punching him, kicking him, leaving him badly injured on the floor of the shebeen. So both of those shocking, violent endings showing us what Tsotsi is capable of. Chapter 3 is very different. There's also a surprise at the end of this chapter. So I hope you're looking forward to the surprise. So it starts off here, Tsotsi leaving the shebeen and going into the street where the sky was low with storm clouds. I suppose the weather there is echoing the mood of Tsotsi, which had at last rolled over the township and the street itself. He kept his back to the shebeen and the street before him. Broad as a river it was, with eddies of life on the corners around the lampposts and the sluggish drift on the pavements. Walking through this without once looking back to the room where Butcher and Diab were whistling through their teeth. Remember, they're whistling through their teeth when they see how badly Boston's injured. And Suki was telling them to take the unconscious man out of her place. That's, of course, Boston. All of this while her gramophone repeated unheeded, and there was no one's listening to it, the meaningless phrase of its last groove. The record player stuck and repeating the same phrase. Walking away, he passed somewhere the woman the two men had taken but earlier. That's Rosie. Yes, Rosie, that they raped outside. Returning now with wet thighs for the drink she had earned. But Tsotsi had no thought for her or the others, seeing only Boston, hearing again his words. So Tsotsi is being haunted by what Boston told him. He saw Boston at the moment when he'd raised himself on the floor and spoken, with the blood in his mouth and the strange look in his eyes. The others had pulled him off before he'd finished. He wanted to work a long time on Boston. He'd only started. And we're moving towards these words. He'd heard them again. His mind had taken up the words and like dice rattled them out of sequence and shape. So here you're going to see Boston's words or hear them, but out of sequence and shape, throwing them now as he walked down the street back into his ears. This is, I don't know if we can call it a stream of consciousness, but these are Boston's words going around and around and around in Tsotsi's head. One day, God help you that day. One day you won't know what to do. These words, they caught the rhythm of his walking. It will happen one day. It will happen. God help you that day, one day. He can't stop these sounds from going around in his head. People see him and they disappear. There's a party going on in a house across the road. Two girls come running out with a bottle, a man with a bottle in his hand, drinking as he ran, the girls laughing. Tsotsi didn't hear the man calling out to them, not even seeing him anymore, because that way he was even more like Boston, speaking through his blood. He closed his eyes and clenched his fists and walked away again, down the street, not noticing the people he pushed aside. So he's still haunted there, these rhythms of these words going around in his head. And you'll remember Boston saying to him, "Can you feel anything?" And that's the key here, I think. So once more we hear these words, one day it will happen. A feeling will happen one day. And God help you that day, one day, that day. And that's what the rest of the novel is going to be about. Something is going to make Tsotsi feel, and how's he going to cope? Then he sees a church. And we're going to see, I don't know if it's the same church, but we're going to see a church again towards the end. I mean, a church, what do we make of a church in this ugly world of its gritty settings, crooked Johannesburg? You'll see towards the end, Tsotsi has little idea of a church. He's at the start of the no man's land between the township and the white suburb. He finally broke the spell of Boston and his words. And he does it through physical activity, but he's out of breath. And he thinks he's safe from seeing Boston in his mind. A car comes. He hides from the car. A clock chimed. Thunder vaulted. Completely at peace for a moment, prowling the streets. The rain, rooftops left wet by the rain, a white world, a prismatic, polished, gleaming world of white surfaces, the streets, the moon-washed walls, and the rooftops almost a glacial white. Are these birds? Oh, crickets. Clock strikes again. And there's this grove of bluegum trees. And this is where the chapter is going to end. Something is going to happen in this grove, this collection of bluegum trees. And because he was tired, suddenly very tired, he turned that way, meaning to rest. When he reached the trees, there were about 20. He slipped quietly to the middle and stood for a moment quite still, noticing for the first time that there was a slight breeze. The moonlight lay around him in pools, splashing over roots and dry leaves, mobile as quicksilver as the treetops moved gently and their shadows shifted on the ground. The wind was just a whisper among the leaves, and branches creaked intermittently with shy complaining sounds. Tsotsi drew in a deep breath. The air was damp and drenched with heavy scent of the bluegums. His eyes, opened wide, mirrored the cataracts of light splashing around him. He was content and stood like that a long time, until his legs throbbed and he remembered he was tired. He sat down with his back to a tree, and no sooner was he comfortable than he regretted it, because immediately the image of Boston rose up before him. I shouldn't have stopped here, he thought. I should have kept on until I could go no more. He was not that tired that he couldn't have stood up. The ache in his legs was no worse than a 10-day-old knife wound. He could have risen to his feet and carried on to another place, another destiny, but he doesn't, so his destiny is going to be here among these bluegum trees, because the stars were busy that night. But instead he chose to remain, and in remaining picked up the silken thread of the chances that were to lead him a strange way. This is about fate. In not moving on, he picks up this thread. It's a metaphorical thread, and it's this thread that's going to lead him to somewhere unexpected. And so the image of Boston considered, now that his violence was spent, without the madness of hate. Boston. He, Tsotsi, had himself picked Boston from the 1,000 lives that drift in the location streets. He had picked Boston because he had a virtue, a good quality, just as Diop had a virtue, which was strength, inhuman strength, and Butcher with his virtue, which was the accuracy that had earned him his name, an accuracy as reliable as the edge of a good knife. He can find the location of the heart. Boston's virtue or good quality being that he was clever. He was a lot of other things as well. He was a coward. He was weak. He talked too much. He drank even more than he talked. But more important than anything else, he was clever. He could think. Boston had already proved himself 100 times over. In as many jobs, his cleverness had engineered success. The little details that got you caught, these Boston thought about. In a panic of fear, it was true, but he thought about them, and that was all that mattered. It was simple, and it would have worked for a long time if it had only stayed like that. Where had it gone wrong? It had gone wrong because Boston started asking questions, even after he was warned, and Tsotsi had not known the answers. When he thought of himself inwardly, Tsotsi thought of darkness. Inwardly there was darkness, something like the midnight hour, only more obscure. At night when he lay on his bed, it was almost one continuum of obscurity. As dark without as within, the darkness is inside him and outside of him, the separation being his flesh. Sleep was the moment when it happened, when he merged with the darkness around him, and everything was black. He never dreamed. This did not disconcert him, provided he lived according to a set of tried and tested rules. He didn't know where they came from, but he had them, and if he failed to observe them, the trouble started. So now we're going to see his rules. The rules of what he does when he wakes up, and I think the point of the rules is to hide from the truth, hide from the light, hide from confronting these questions that he doesn't want to answer. The first rule was the rule of the waking moment. That moment always came as a miracle, a sudden eruption of light as he opened his eyes, and sound as well as sensation, feeling and smelling. Being born 20 years old with the smell of the womb in your nostrils and its darkness behind your back. It was a moment of great peril, great danger, because the impact of the world around him on his senses was like a flood that threatened to tear him away from his moorings. Moorings is where a boat is anchored. So it's a boating metaphor. And cast him adrift on a new day, as aimless as the others caught in the wanton tides of the location streets. It was at this moment that his first rule operated. It was simply that before doing anything else, eating, washing, pissing, he had to see to his knife. It was a sheath knife, the blade 4 inches long. The handle was made of wood and was kept in place by 2 copper studs, and he carried it in the back pocket of his trousers and slept with it under his jacket, which he rolled up and used as a pillow. He would take it out in the room in the morning and look at it. This meant testing the edge on the soft ball of the thumb, and if it couldn't shave off a thin wafer of skin, then sharpening it. He used a stone for this, which he kept in his room. Sharpening it was, as someone had once shown him, to spit on the stone, and then to work the blade lightly backwards and forwards. And if it wasn't in need of sharpening, he would simply play with it for a few seconds, enjoying the security of it in his hand. He knew the knife. The feel of it was familiar, its purpose obvious. It was his, and he knew how to use it. These thoughts were cast out like mooring ropes, something that anchors him, and tied him firmly to what he knew. Whatever the case might be, the blade dull or as keen as sight, when he put it away in his pocket and looked up, the day was his. He, Tsotsi, knew himself and his dark purpose, and everything was all right. The knife was not only his weapon, but also a fetish, a talisman, a charm that conjured away bad spirits and established him securely in his life. His second rule, and this is the one that Boston breaks with all his questions, which operated from then on through every other moment of the day, was never to disturb his inward darkness with the light of a thought about himself or the attempt at a memory. He was not only resigned to not knowing about himself, he didn't want to know anything. This was an instinctive caution in Tsotsi to leave well alone. It was also the hardest of all his rules, because of the independent and irrational nature of life. There was only a limited area that he controlled absolutely. The vaster regions of it operated regardless of him, sometimes running against his purpose. Sometimes something simple would catch a sense, something evocative of something in his past. The smell of wet newspaper did it, and it would stir and start associations charged with pain and mystery inside him. And here's something that makes him a bit vulnerable, a fear that he has. Once, feeling secure in his bed in his room, he had seen a spider working at its web in a corner of the ceiling, and seeing this he had known a moment of acute terror, and had passed a night without sleep, almost hypnotized by the spider, too frightened to kill it. And all he knew was that the insect, unexplainably, had evoked terror, and that something frightened and very small had moved within him. Sometimes these encounters with his past were more of a definite nature. I think I'm going to skip this policeman story over here and the prisoner that they bump into. And this is, I think, the first time we find out Tsotsi's name. I don't know if we work it out this first time, that this prisoner called Tsotsi David. Tsotsi looked away, picked up the dice and rolled them. David, the man called David. It's me, Peter. David, help me. David, he called. But Tsotsi had closed his ears, so he's tried to pretend he's not called David. And he doesn't want to know his real name. He made himself forget. This was the furthest that Tsotsi had ever gone back into his past. His third and final rule was really an extension of the second. The second was not wanting to confront the truth. It was the rule Boston had broken. Tsotsi tolerated no questions from another. It wasn't just that he was caught without answers. It went deeper than that. Those questions sounded the vast depths of his darkness, making it a tangible reality. To know nothing about yourself is to be constantly in danger of nothingness, those voids of non-being over which a man walks the tightrope of his life. Tsotsi feared nothingness. He feared it because he believed in it. Even more than that, he knew with all the certainty of his being that behind the facade of life lurked nothing. The facade is the front, the appearance. So he is sure that beyond that facade there's nothing. Under men's prayers, he had heard the deep silence of it. Behind man's beauty, he had seen it, faceless and waiting. Inside man himself, beyond the lights of his loves and his hopes, there too is nothing. A darkness like an enormous unending night that closed in when the fires burnt low and out, leaving only ash as an epitaph to their passing warmth. The problem of his life was to maintain himself, to affirm his existence in the face of this nullity, this nothingness. He achieved this through pain and fear, and through death. He knew no other way. When Gumbu died, and in those last few seconds before death, had looked hard with hate and then fear at the young man who had chosen him, that moment Tsotsi had known he was alive. It's to people seeing him with hate and with fear that makes him know that he's alive. It was as simple as that. Tsotsi still sat with his back to the tree with these thoughts, or his equivalents of them, the personal spectres that carried their meaning, some visual, seen inwardly like the face of his first killing. Others felt like the twitch in the nerves of his groin when he had savoured the meaning of killing. He finds something almost erotic about killing. These had been passing through his head for a long time, and now he was tired. He was not good at thinking. He stood up, determined to run again, to leave the trees. He was already moving when he heard the sound, so he stopped, slipped quietly into a shadow, and waited. What he had heard were footsteps, about 10 at a time, coming at regular intervals as someone moved down the street, crossing the silent squares of grass on the pavement, and then the driveways to the garages with the sound of a shoe on cement. They were regular but rapid, the rhythm of hurry and fear, almost a run. When he heard them coming steadily closer, Tsotsi moved to one of the trees on the edge of the grove. It was a young woman, a black woman, coming toward him in the night. She was wearing a long coat, unbuttoned, and underneath it he could see a white garment that could have been a petticoat. She carried a small parcel, and she kept on looking back. It sounds like she's running from someone. From his position under the tree, Tsotsi recognized without hesitation the symptoms of fear. Nothing else moved a human being the same way. He had seen it often. She held her parcel as if it were her last hold on life itself. Even if their hands were empty, they would hold themselves, hand holding hand. She was nearer now, and he could see that the parcel was a shoebox. Fear, too, and fear alone, made you see a threat of danger in every shadow, which is how she was, her head turning constantly from side to side. But most of all, fear made you hurry. She was caught in an ungainly rhythm between walking and running, almost tripping over her feet in her hurry. Once or twice, with a few steps quicker than the rest, it seemed as if she was about to break into a run. But each time something stopped her, and she fell back into her stumbling lope, her stumbling movement. Tsotsi watched her from under the trees. Without realizing it, his heart began to beat faster. He's thinking of some crime or another. It was almost perfect. The woman came towards him in the night. He didn't know her. He didn't hate. But he slipped slyly from tree to tree to the point where she would enter the grove. He didn't know what he was going to do, but his fingers flexed at his side. His hands were ready. She was opposite him now, having paused on her way to lean against a wall and shake her head. She crossed the street and walked into the grove of bluegum trees. He caught her by one arm and swung her into the darkness, his hand cutting short the scream of terror that had fallen from her lips like splintering glass. A second move forced her against a tree, and there, with his body pressed against hers, a knee already between her legs, and his hand still on her mouth, there he looked into her eyes. Sounds like he wants to rape her. She struggled once, but he held her firmly. She clutched her shoebox with even greater desperation. For a few seconds, neither moved. He studied her calmly, her eyes, her neck with the pulse of an artery under the warm skin, deliberating his next move, while the warmth of her body crept into his, and her breasts, full and firm, panicked under the weight of her chest. Unknowingly, he relaxed his grip. With a twist of her head, she freed a corner of her mouth and screamed a second time. But before he could do anything, his attention was torn away from her to the shoebox she carried. He released her and stepped back sharply. She had stopped her scream and was staring now at the box with the horror deeper than her fear of him. And what's the horror? She knows she's going to give this box to him. And it's what's inside the box that terrifies her, that she's going to give it away, but she's going to give it away to save herself. With both hands she lifted it, and when nothing happened, she held it up to him, and for a second time he backed away. With a sudden movement, she thrust it into his hands, and he held it clumsily. Tsotsi only had eyes for the box now, and ears too, neither seeing nor hearing the woman as she turned away, and with a low sob, again because of what it is she's leaving with him, ran back the way she had come, deep into the white night. The lid had slipped off in the sudden impulse of her generosity. Tsotsi had found himself looking at a face that was small and black and older than anything he'd ever seen in his life. It was lined and wrinkled with an age beyond years. The sound that had stopped him and saved the woman was the cry of a baby. And the end of this chapter is so clever because it saves this word baby for the very last word. So that's the absolute surprise that this gangster, whom we've seen committing horrific deeds, is left holding this box with a baby in it. So you can think now how that question that Boston asked is going to become the central question of the novel. Will he learn to feel? Can someone like Tsotsi learn to feel? And I guess at the same time we're going to learn how someone can become a gangster like Tsotsi does. So I hope this was a surprise twist at the end of chapter 3. I'm just going to look for one thing. And I thought the baby made a sound here. She screamed, and his attention was drawn from her to the shoebox. He released her and stepped back sharply. I thought it was the sound of the baby there that made him look, but I don't see the sound of the baby here. And then once again, this horror that she feels when she realizes what she's going to do to save herself. She's going to leave the baby with him. And that was chapter 3 of Tsotsi.